3,000 feet of black Pacific water pressed against the pressure hull, and the metal groaned. Not the sharp crack that meant failure. I'd heard those recordings enough times to know the difference, but the low, continuous protest of titanium alloy holding back a column of seawater that weighed more than most people could imagine. I sat in the pilot's sphere of the Thetis, my submersible, watching the depth gauge tick past 3,200 feet. The twin LED arrays cut pale cones through darkness, so complete it made midnight look bright. Sediment drifted through the beams. Nothing else moved out there. My hand stayed steady on the controls. 6 years piloting deep-sea research vehicles had worn the nervousness out of me, left just the procedural calm and the constant mental checklist. Ballast pressure normal, life support nominal, hull temperature dropping as expected. The coffee I'd finished an hour ago sat cold in my bladder, but I wasn't surfacing until I'd seen what I came for. The sonar display flickered in my peripheral vision. I'd been watching it more than the viewports. Down here you saw with sound first, light second. The return signal painted green shapes on the black screen, topology of the seafloor rising to meet me as I descended along the trench edge. Then the display changed. 12 distinct contacts appeared at once, arranged in a pattern too regular to be geological. Almost circular. Each signature showed the dense angular returns of worked metal, not volcanic rock. I felt my breath catch, just for a second, before the analytical part of my brain kicked in and started measuring distances, estimating sizes. Wrecks. Had to be. The sonar profile matched submarine hulls, that elongated teardrop shape, the conning tower protrusions on some of them. I'd spent 6 months fighting for this dive, 6 months of proposals and revisions, of sitting in Dr. Kelly Medina's office at the Hadley Oceanographic Institute while she explained in that careful Boston accent why the board needed more evidence, more documentation, more certainty before they'd authorize the expense. She'd worn her reputation like armor. 20 years running Hadley. Enough published papers to fill a bookshelf. Connections in Washington and Brussels and Tokyo. I'd shown her the satellite imaging first. The new synthetic aperture radar could penetrate seawater to depths that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. And the commercial survey company had sold me their data for less than my truck was worth. The images were grainy, ambiguous, but they showed metal where the charts said there should be nothing but seafloor. She'd studied them through her designer frames, lips pressed thin. Could be geological. Look at the spacing. I'd pulled up my analysis, the measurements I'd taken. 12 objects arranged in an arc. Interval variance less than 8%. Nature can be surprisingly regular. Not this regular. We'd gone back and forth. I'd brought her the archival research next, 3 weeks of digging through naval records, war diaries, after-action reports from August 1943. The Pacific Theater was chaos that summer. Solomon's campaign, fighting in New Guinea, submarines ranging across Japanese supply lines. But not here. Not at these coordinates, 200 nautical miles from any documented convoy route or patrol area. That was the hook I'd used. The impossibility of it. Kelly Medina had built her career on discoveries that rewrote what we thought we knew. Hydrothermal vent ecosystems, extremophile bacteria that shouldn't exist. Geological formations that violated accepted models. She understood the value of impossible things, once you proved they were real. The funding approval came through on a Tuesday morning. Enough for one dive, one chance to confirm the satellite data and document whatever was down there. She'd called me into her office, and I'd found her standing by the window overlooking Monterey Bay, hands clasped behind her back. The board approved your proposal. I'd felt my heart rate spike, kept my voice level. When can I launch? 2 weeks. The Thetis is finishing a survey run off Alaska. She'll be available when she returns. She'd turned to face me. Tom, you understand this is preliminary reconnaissance only. Document the site, collect imagery, return with evidence we can analyze. No hull penetrations, no artifact recovery, nothing that risks the vehicle. Understood. And if you find what you think you'll find? She'd paused, choosing words. We'll need to involve the appropriate authorities. Naval wrecks are graves. There are protocols. I'd nodded. Didn't mention that I'd already thought through those complications, already accepted them as the price of knowing. Now, 3,000 feet down with those 12 contacts glowing on my sonar, the weight of what I might have found pressed harder than the water outside. I adjusted my descent angle, vectoring toward the nearest signature. The sonar gave me distance and bearing, but the details would come from the cameras. My right hand worked the thruster controls, while my left brought the external lighting to full power. The LEDs drew enough current to drain my batteries 8% faster, but I needed the illumination. The seafloor materialized below me. Volcanic rock, dark gray and porous, covered in the pale sediment that drifted down here like slow snow. I'd read somewhere it took a century for an inch of that ooze to accumulate. Everything down here operated on geological time, except for the things humans dropped into it. The first wreck emerged from the darkness like something surfacing in reverse. German U-boat. I recognized the type immediately. 70C, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet. She lay canted against a volcanic outcropping, her bow pointing into the current, stern settled lower, where the seafloor dropped away. The conning tower stood intact, still showing the fair water planes that would have helped her dive and surface. Rust had consumed the deck plating, turned it into brown-orange layers that looked soft as tissue paper. I brought the Thetis closer, adjusting trim to hold position about 20 feet off her hull. The current pushed at me, gentle down here but constant. I compensated with the thrusters, keeping the cameras pointed at the wreck. My hand reached for the recording controls. The external cameras were already running, but I tapped the backup system to life anyway. Redundancy. Everything in deep submergence work came down to redundancy and checklists. Beginning documentation of Contact 1, I said aloud. Habit from years of solo dives. The audio recorded with the video and talking helped me think. German Type 7C U-boat, approximately 220 feet in length. Bearing 270 degrees, list approximately 30 degrees to port. I stopped talking, leaned closer to the monitors, close enough my breath fogged the screen for a second. The hull was intact, not just structurally sound, intact, whole. The pressure hull showed corrosion, showed the biological fouling you'd expect after 8 decades underwater, but it didn't show damage. No torpedo impact crater, no depth charge scarring, those distinctive dimpled patterns where explosives compressed metal inward. No collision damage, no buckling from crush depth failure. I panned the cameras slowly along her length, bow to stern. Checked the deck, the ballast tank vents, the conning tower. Rust everywhere, marine growth in patches, but underneath it all the submarine looked like she'd simply settled here. Parked herself against this outcropping and stopped. My mouth had gone dry. Submarines didn't sink themselves. They went down fighting or fleeing, torn open by enemy action or their own mechanical failures. They didn't sail into the middle of nowhere and die without a mark on them. I adjusted the Thetis's position, moving aft along the wreck. The stern section came into focus. Rudder still attached, propeller blades bent slightly, probably from settling against the rocks. The external torpedo tubes showed empty, their outer doors open to the sea. She'd fired her weapons. Sometime before she sank, her crew had launched torpedoes at something. At what? There was nothing out here. No shipping lanes, no harbors, no targets worth the fuel to reach them. I checked my air supply. 4 hours remaining, maybe 5 if I was conservative with the CO2 scrubbers. Enough time to document all 12 wrecks if I moved efficiently. The sonar showed the next contact bearing 185 degrees, distant 70 meters. I pitched the Thetis forward and increased power to the main thruster, lifting away from the U-boat. She dropped behind me, swallowed by the darkness outside my light cones. The facts cycled through my head while I navigated. 12 submarines, 3 nations, 72 hours in August 1943. No battle record, no survivors, no distress calls that made it into any archive I could access. And now, no damage. The Pacific stretched 3,000 feet above me, and I was alone with something that shouldn't exist. The American submarine sat 200 yards northeast of the German wreck, its bow tilted 15 degrees into the silt. Gato class. I recognized the configuration before I read the hull number. I'd spent enough hours studying recognition manuals to identify the distinctive deck gun placement and conning tower profile from half a mile out in murky water. This water wasn't murky. Crystal clarity that shouldn't exist at 3,000 feet. I brought the submersible around to the port side, thrusters barely firing. The hull showed the same corrosion pattern as the German vessel. 70 years of slow oxidation. Nothing catastrophic. No torpedo damage. No collision scars. Just time doing its patient work on steel. My hands moved through the checklist without conscious thought. External floodlights at full intensity. Hull-mounted camera recording. Sonar in passive mode, painting the wreck's dimensions onto my screen. 298 feet from bow to stern. Standard configuration. The forward torpedo room hatch sat sealed in its frame. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not panic. Something quieter. The recognition that what I'd found on the German boat wasn't an isolated anomaly. I worked my way aft, counting hatches. Forward torpedo room, sealed. Forward battery compartment, sealed. Officers' quarters, control room, after battery, every single pressure door locked tight in its frame, dogging wheels turned to the closed position. The conning tower hatch hadn't budged. I'd seen enough sunken vessels to know what catastrophic failure looked like. Hatches blown outward by internal pressure. Hull plating peeled back by torpedo detonations. The twisted metal geography of violent death. This wasn't that. This was a submarine that had settled to the bottom intact and simply stopped. Stopped with her crew inside. I moved to the next wreck. Japanese I-class, lying on her starboard side with her bow pointing northwest. Same story. Sealed hatches. Minimal damage. No sign of the violence that should have accompanied her sinking. Then a British T-class boat. Another German U-boat. This one Type 7C. An American fleet submarine. Her hull number still partially visible through the corrosion. Every single one intact. Every single one sealed. I kept a running tally on my slate, marking each vessel's position and condition. The data built into something that made no sense. 12 submarines from 4 different navies, all sunk within a 72-hour window according to Freddie's logs, and not one of them showed signs of combat damage severe enough to explain their presence on the ocean floor. No distress calls, no survivors, no breaches, just death in sealed steel coffins. The American Gato class sat waiting when I circled back to it. I'd spotted the corrosion damage on my first pass. A section of hull plating near the after battery compartment, where 70 years of salt water had eaten through the steel. Jagged edges, hole maybe 2 feet across. Big enough. I brought the submersible to a hover 30 feet from the breach and powered up the remote camera drone. The ROV slid out of its deployment bay with a soft mechanical whir that transmitted through the hull. I watched it on the external camera feed, a small black shape trailing its umbilical tether, 4 miniature thrusters adjusting its position in the water. The control interface lit up my right-hand screen. Pitch, yaw, depth, camera angle. My fingers found the controls, muscle memory from 1,000 deployments. The drone moved forward, its LED array cutting a cone of white light through the black water. I guided it toward the breach, making minor adjustments to keep it centered on the opening. The corroded edges filled my screen, then slid past as the camera entered the hull. The after-battery compartment materialized in the drone's floodlights. I stopped the ROV's forward motion. Let it hang there, camera panning slowly across the interior. The batteries themselves had degraded into shapeless masses of lead and acid residue. Deck plating showed through in patches where the corrosion had been worst. But the compartment's basic structure remained intact. Bulkheads, overhead piping, the pressure door leading forward into officers' country. And bodies. Not bodies. Remains. Skeletons in the tattered remnants of uniforms. I'd expected that. 70 years at depth, anything organic would be long gone except for bone. What I hadn't expected was their positions. One skeleton sat against the forward bulkhead, legs extended, arms resting at its sides. Another lay curled on its side near the battery bank, skull tilted at an angle that suggested it had simply folded there and never moved again. A third actually stood, wedged between 2 battery housings, one skeletal hand gripping an overhead pipe. They hadn't drowned. Drowning meant struggling, thrashing, clawing toward air. These men looked like they'd been frozen mid-motion and simply stopped. I guided the drone through the pressure door into officers' country. Had to angle it carefully through the opening. The door stood partially open. Dogging wheel turned halfway. Someone had been opening it when they died. The skeletal hand still gripped the wheel. My breathing sounded too loud in the submersible's confined space. I forced myself to slow it down, focus on the controls, keep the drone moving. Control room next. The nerve center of the submarine, where the diving officer would have stood at the ballast board, where the helmsman and plainsman manned their wheels, where the captain would have gripped the periscope handles and called out orders. They were all still there. Skeleton at the ballast board, both hands on controls. 2 more at the helm station, sitting upright in positions that must have been their duty stations. Another slumped over the chart table, skull resting on folded arms. The captain, had to be the captain, stood near the periscope well. One hand reached toward the control surface, fingers extended. He'd been reaching for something when death came. I panned the camera slowly across the scene. The drone's lights picked out details I didn't want to see but couldn't stop recording. Tattered uniform remnants still clinging to bone. Personal effects scattered on the deck. A waterlogged wallet. The corroded remains of a wristwatch. Something that might have been a photograph before the ocean dissolved it. No signs of fire. No blast damage. No indication that water had flooded the compartment in a violent rush. They just died. All of them. Simultaneously, while sitting at their posts or standing at their stations doing whatever they'd been doing in the moments before death arrived. My stomach twisted. Not nausea exactly. Something deeper. The visceral wrongness of what I was seeing. I'd reviewed casualty reports from dozens of submarine disasters. I knew what death looked like in these steel tubes. Men drowned when compartments flooded. They suffocated when fire consumed their oxygen. They burned when electrical systems shorted out. They died slowly from carbon monoxide poisoning or quickly from pressure hull failure. They didn't just stop. The drone's camera feed showed me another skeleton in the radio room, seated at the communications panel, one hand near the telegraph key. He'd been at his station when it happened. Maybe listening to traffic from the surface. Maybe preparing to send a message. He'd never sent it. I backed the ROV out through the breach and recovered it to its bay. My hands moved through the procedure automatically while my brain tried to process what I'd just seen. The recording equipment had captured everything. Hull-mounted cameras, drone footage, sonar data, depth readings, timestamps. All of it stored on redundant drives, backed up to 3 separate systems, because I'd learned a long time ago that the ocean loved destroying evidence. This evidence would survive. Whatever else happened, I had proof. Proof of what, exactly? 12 submarines, 4 navies, 72 hours, no distress calls, no survivors, no damage severe enough to explain their sinking. And inside at least one of them, inside all of them probably, crews dead at their stations without warning or struggle. Something had killed them. Something instantaneous enough that trained submariners hadn't even had time to react. No scramble for escape hatches, no attempt to surface. Just sudden, absolute cessation. The mystery of it sat in my chest, heavy and cold. Freddy's logs had brought me here because he'd noticed the pattern. 12 boats lost in the same grid square during the same 3-day window. An anomaly buried in historical records that nobody else had thought to question. Now I was sitting 3,000 feet down, surrounded by the proof that something impossible had happened here. And I had no idea what it was. The thought consumed everything else. Not fear, exactly, though that lurked at the edges. Not even the scientific excitement of discovering something unprecedented, though that was there too. Just the overwhelming need to understand, to find the mechanism, to answer the question that these wrecks posed. What could kill 12 submarines and their crews without leaving any trace of how it happened? I stared at the camera feeds showing the American boat's hull, still and silent in the crystal water. Somewhere inside that steel coffin, 70-some men sat at their stations, waiting 70 years for someone to ask the right questions. I was asking now, and I wasn't leaving until I had answers. The third wreck was Japanese. Kagero-class destroyer, hull number barely visible through the corrosion. I brought the submersible alongside at 11:47, my hands moving through the control sequence without conscious thought. The cameras showed me what I'd already started to expect. 3 sailors at the starboard torpedo tubes. One had his hand on the loading mechanism. Another held a clipboard. Inventory sheet, maybe, or firing solution calculations. The third stood with his mouth open, frozen mid-word. Whatever he'd been saying to his crewmates, he never finished it. I panned the external lights across the deck. No bullet holes, no shrapnel scoring. The anti-aircraft gun sat unmanned but undamaged, barrels pointed at nothing. My stomach had gone tight. I logged the footage, marked the coordinates, moved on. Wreck 4 was another American boat, smaller than the first one I'd examined. Probably a patrol craft, something fast that shouldn't have been this far from any documented convoy route. The hull had settled at a 40-degree angle, bow down in the sediment. I maneuvered the submersible to peer through a blown-out section of the bridge. 2 officers. One slumped over what looked like a radio set. The other sitting upright in the captain's chair, hands resting on the armrests, head tilted back. His jaw hung slack. Eyes gone, of course. The scavengers always took the soft tissue first, but the posture read clear enough. No defensive wounds, no signs he'd braced for impact or tried to abandon ship. Just stopped. I checked my oxygen mix. The readouts were fine, but my breathing had gotten shallow anyway. The 5th wreck took me 20 minutes to identify. German again, but smaller than the U-boat. A supply vessel, maybe, or a mine layer. The stern had crumpled on impact with the seafloor. but the forward sections remained mostly intact. I found 6 crew members in the galley. 3 sat at a table with tin plates in front of them. 2 stood at what might have been a serving line. The 6th was halfway through a doorway, 1 foot raised like he'd been taking a step. The plates still held the desiccated remnants of whatever they'd been eating. My hands trembled on the controls. I had to stop, breathe, count to 10 before I could work the cameras properly. No panic, no struggle. They'd been eating lunch, and then they died. Just like that. Wreck 6 was the worst so far. Another Japanese vessel, a cargo ship this time. Civilian hull pressed into military service, probably. The hold had been loaded with crated supplies. I could see the containers through a rupture in the hull plating, stacked and secured with cargo netting. I found the crew in the forward berthing area. 18 men, maybe 20. Hard to count them all, the way they'd settled over the decades. Some in bunks, others on the floor between the racks. One sitting with his back against a bulkhead, knees drawn up, hands folded in his lap. Off duty, resting, sleeping, writing letters home. And then not. I had to back the submersible away. My vision had started to tunnel, black creeping in at the edges. The pressure hull felt too small suddenly, the recycled air too thin. I'd seen bodies before, worked 3 different wreck sites during my graduate research, documented remains, cataloged personal effects, maintained professional detachment. This was different. This was wrong in a way that bypassed analysis and hit somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't care about data or methodology. I forced myself to log the coordinates, mark the footage, move to the next site. The 7th wreck was American, small patrol vessel, similar to number 4. I found the crew at their action stations, gunners at the deck guns, radio man at his set, helmsman at the wheel, ready for combat that never came. The 8th was German, officers in the wardroom, frozen over a tactical map. One of them had a compass in his hand, the point touching the chart, planning their next move, a move they never made. The 9th was Japanese, engine room crew, 4 of them, scattered among the machinery. One had been climbing a ladder. Still was, technically, his skeletal hands gripping the rungs 3/4 of the way up. By the time I reached the 10th wreck, my hands had stopped shaking. The fear had burned through into something colder, more focused. This wasn't random, wasn't coincidence. 10 vessels, 3 different navies, different classes, different sizes, different functions, scattered across a square mile of sea floor with no charted engagement to explain their presence, and every single crew dead at their posts. No combat damage, no disease symptoms. I would have seen evidence in the bone structure, the positioning, the distribution of remains. No mechanical failures, no flooding, no fire. They'd just stopped. All of them. At once. The 10th wreck gave me nothing new. Neither did the 11th. Japanese torpedo boat, German patrol craft. Same story, same inexplicable scene. I checked my chronometer at 14:23, 2 hours and change since I'd started the survey. 7 wrecks documented in detail, 4 more given cursory examination. I had gigabytes of footage, hundreds of still images, precise coordinates and detailed notes, and absolutely no explanation for what I was looking at. I brought the submersible back to the American submarine, the first one, the Gatto-class boat that had started this whole mess. My hands worked the ballast controls, the thruster adjustments, the camera angles, autopilot muscle memory while my brain chewed on the problem. Pattern recognition was supposed to be my strength. Give me enough data points, I could find the thread that connected them. That's what I did. Saw the shapes others missed. Asked the questions no one else thought to ask. But this... I couldn't even formulate the right question yet. What kills 10 ships' worth of crew simultaneously? What leaves no physical evidence, no signs of struggle, no damage to the vessels themselves? Chemical weapon, maybe. Some kind of nerve agent. Except nerve agents leave traces. Specific post-mortem positioning. And they don't explain why the ships themselves all sank, scattered across a mile of ocean floor with no signs of coordinated attack. I docked the submersible's cameras against one of the American sub's portholes, stared at the sailor inside, still wearing his headphones, still facing his sonar display. He'd been listening to something. The thought crystallized slowly, working its way up from my subconscious. These crews hadn't just died at their posts. They'd died mid-task, mid-action. The Japanese sailor loading the torpedo tube, the German officer plotting a course, the American radio man at his set. They'd been working, responding, reacting to something. And the sonar operator had been listening. I checked the submersible's power reserves. 18 hours remaining, more than enough. The American submarine's hull had corroded in places, but the main structure remained intact. I'd studied enough naval architecture to know where they kept the recording equipment. The Gato-class boats had continuous loop wire recorders for their sonar arrays, primitive by modern standards, but functional. Designed to survive depths and pressure. Designed to preserve data. I maneuvered the submersible aft, looking for the external access panel. Found it near the sail, half buried in sediment. The mechanical arm took 4 minutes to clear the buildup, another 3 to work the corroded latches. The panel came free. Inside, wrapped in rubberized waterproofing that had mostly held, I found the recording mechanism. Wire spools, magnetic tape, the whole antiquated assembly, 70 years underwater. The salt water should have destroyed it. Probably had destroyed most of it. But maybe not all. I used the manipulator arm to extract the main spool, working with the kind of surgical precision that usually required 3 tries and a lot of cursing. Got it on the second attempt this time. My hands were steady again. Purpose did that, gave you something to focus on besides the fear. The submersible had a portable playback unit in the equipment locker. I'd brought it for exactly this kind of scenario. Brought a lot of things I'd thought I might need, back when I'd believed this expedition would answer questions instead of spawning new ones. I secured the spool, connected the leads, adjusted the ancient tracking mechanism. Hit playback. Static first. Expected that. The recording was decades old, corroded, half destroyed by pressure and time. Then voices. Faint, distorted, but recognizable as human speech. American accents. Technical chatter. Someone calling out bearing changes. Someone else acknowledging. Normal operations. Standard patrol procedures. The voices stopped. More static. Then something else. Not static. Not mechanical noise. Not anything I could identify from my admittedly limited audio analysis training. A sound. Low frequency. Regular interval. Almost rhythmic, but not quite. Like a pulse, but wrong. Off somehow, in a way that made my inner ear ache. The sound continued for 6 seconds. Then silence. Then the recording ended. I sat in the submersible's pilot seat, staring at the playback unit's corroded dials. Played it again. The voices. The static. The sound. 6 seconds of something that had no business being in the Pacific Ocean in 1943. 6 seconds that had somehow killed everyone who heard it. My mouth had gone dry. I played it a 3rd time, listening through the submersible's speakers, trying to analyze it, break it down into components I could understand. The frequency was wrong. Too low for most natural sources. Too regular for geological activity. too organic for mechanical equipment. And underneath it, buried in the distortion, something else. A complexity I couldn't quite parse. Harmonics, maybe. Overtones. Patterns within patterns. My headache had returned. Worse than before. Sharp pain behind my eyes that made the instrument panel swim. I stopped the playback. Sat in the darkness 3,000 feet below the surface. 12 ships. Hundreds of dead. All of them stopped mid-action, switched off in an instant. And now I had a recording of what had killed them. A sound that shouldn't exist. A sound that came from somewhere in the empty Pacific. A sound that, somehow, had just given me the worst headache of my life after 3 plays through a 70-year-old recording. I looked out through the viewport at the American submarine, at the sailor frozen at his sonar station, headphones still clamped over his skull. He'd heard it too. Heard it directly, in real time, without the buffer of decades and seawater and corroded wire. I thought about what that might have done to him. Then I thought about the fact that something had made that sound. Something had been here, in this exact location, 70 years ago. Something that could kill with a 6-second pulse of noise. The Pacific stretched 3,000 feet above me, and God knew how many miles in every direction around me. And somewhere out in that darkness, something was waiting. The German transmission came first in my review, chronologically the earliest by 2 days. I'd pulled the audio files from the data recorder, what remained of it anyway, and the voice that crackled through my headset spoke Hochdeutsch with a Baltic accent. The translation software rendered it into text on my secondary screen, but I could pick out enough words myself. Contact, Unterseeboot, unmöglich, contact, submarine, impossible. The commander, I never found his name in any archive, described a sonar signature, moving at 40 knots, then 50, then diving past 200 meters while maintaining speed, continuing down past 300, 400 depths that would have crushed any hull the Kriegsmarine ever built. He'd thought it was American. Some new technology, something the intelligence reports had missed. The recording ended mid-sentence. I sat in the pilot seat with the headset pressed against my ears and stared at the depth gauge. 3,020 feet. The German submarine rested 3,000 feet down with no damage to its hull, and its commander's last words describe something diving past crush depth without slowing. The Japanese transmission told the same story in different words. I didn't speak Japanese, couldn't pick out individual words the way I could with German, but the translation came through clear enough. The destroyer's sonar operator reported a massive contact, speed estimated at 45 knots, course erratic. They'd fired torpedoes. The operator's voice rose in pitch as he described the contact diving, going deeper than their weapons could track, deeper than anything should survive. Then depth charges. I heard those in the background of the recording, the distinct crack of explosions transmitted through water. The operator's final words, according to the translation, still descending, still moving. This is not possible. Static after that. I pulled the headset off and rubbed my eyes behind my glasses. The cabin felt smaller than it had an hour ago. The pressure hull groaned, just the normal sounds of deep submersion, thermal contraction, nothing dangerous, but my shoulders tensed anyway. 3 wrecks, 3 navies, same story. The American transmission was last. I'd saved it without knowing why, some instinct to delay, and when I finally queued up the audio file, my hands were steady on the controls, but my jaw was clenched tight enough to ache. The voice that came through the speakers was American, Midwest. Flat vowels, matter-of-fact tone. Young. I ran the timestamp against the service records I'd downloaded before the dive. Couldn't access the cloud down here, but I'd learned years ago to cache everything I might need. and found the name after 15 minutes of cross-referencing. Petty Officer Freddie Bravo, sonar operator, 23 years old, Detroit, Michigan, enlisted in 41, assigned to submarine duty after basic training, cited twice for exceptional performance, wrote clear, detailed logs that his commanders praised for accuracy. Died August 9, 1943, cause unknown, lost at sea, no remains recovered. I stared at his service photo on my screen. Round face, cleft chin, pale eyes that looked straight at the camera with the kind of open expression that suggested he hadn't yet seen anything that would make him distrust the world. He'd been down here in this same darkness, breathing recycled air that tasted of oil and sweat, listening to something his training couldn't explain. I pressed play on his final log entry. Contact bearing 270, range approximately 1,000 yards. His voice was steady, professional. Speed. I'm reading 42 knots, 45 now. Contact is accelerating. A pause. I heard paper rustling. Him checking his instruments, maybe, or his manual, making sure he was reading the displays correctly. Contact is diving, passing 300 feet, 350, 400. Another pause, longer this time. Contact maintaining speed at 450 feet. Someone spoke in the background. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was sharp. A question, maybe an order. Freddie's response came quieter. Yes, sir, I'm sure. The signature it's massive. Bigger than anything in the recognition manual. And the sound. He trailed off. I leaned forward. The submersible's cabin lights reflected off the screens, turning everything outside the viewports into perfect blackness. Permission to describe the acoustic signature, sir? A pause while someone responded. It's like metal grinding against metal, but there's something else underneath. Almost like whale song, but wrong. The frequency keeps shifting. It's making my teeth hurt. More background voices, agitated now. Contact is rising. Ascending at, Jesus, 60 knots vertical. Now bearing. It's circling us. Range decreasing. 800 yards. 700. Freddie's voice had lost its professional steadiness. I heard the strain creeping in, the kind of tension that came from watching your instruments tell you something impossible while your training insisted instruments didn't lie. 600 yards. The sound is getting louder. Johnson just took off his headset. Said his ears were bleeding. I can hear it through the hull now. Everyone's covering their ears. Captain's ordering. The sound that came through the speakers made me rip the headset off. Even through the small speakers, even filtered through 80 years and 3,000 feet of seawater and whatever degradation the recording equipment had suffered, it hit me like a physical thing. Metal grinding, yes, but also something organic, something that resonated in frequencies that made my back teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I sat there with the headset in my lap, breathing hard. The recording had cut to static. I checked the timestamp. 3 seconds of that sound, then nothing. Freddie Bravo had stopped transmitting at 0942 local time on August 9th, 1943. He'd died listening to that. My hands were shaking. I put the headset on the console and flexed my fingers, trying to work out the tremor. 3 wrecks. 3 different navies, 3 different languages, 3 different commanders making 3 different tactical decisions. The Germans had run. The Japanese had attacked. The Americans had held position, probably trying to identify the contact before committing to action. All 3 ships rested on the bottom with no hull damage. All 3 crews died at their stations, and all 3 had tracked something that moved too fast, dove too deep, and made a sound that human engineering couldn't produce. I pulled up the sonar data from my own submersible. The contact I'd recorded earlier, the one that had moved through the water while I was examining the American submarine, sat in my memory buffer as a series of acoustic signatures that my software couldn't classify. I ran it through the analysis program anyway. Watched the frequency distribution graph populate, the speed calculations render, the size estimates compile. 43 knots. Estimated length, over 300 feet. Maximum recorded depth, 4,200 feet. I sat back in the pilot's seat. The pressure hull groaned again. And this time I didn't tell myself it was normal thermal contraction. This time I listened. Nothing but the groan, the hum of my life support, the quiet ping of the passive sonar maintaining its watch on the water around me. I queued up Freddy's final log entry again. Didn't put the headset on. Couldn't make myself do that. Just let it play through the cabin speakers at low volume. His voice filled the small space, matter-of-fact and professional right up until it wasn't. And when the sound started, I stopped the playback before it could complete. My hands were steady now. I'd spent 12 years studying deep ocean phenomena, bioluminescence patterns, hydrothermal vent ecosystems, pressure adaptation in extreme depth species. I'd published 17 papers. I'd given lectures. I knew what lived down here in the dark. This wasn't that. The realization settled into my chest like cold water, and I felt the hair rise on my arms despite the cabin's stable temperature. I was still sitting there, still staring at Freddy Bravo's service photo on my screen, still trying to process what 3 separate navies had independently recorded, when the engine noise changed. Not the normal fluctuation of the electric drive, not the slight variation in pitch that came from current draw. A stuttering, a hesitation in the steady hum that had been my constant companion for 6 hours. I turned to the engineering panel. The battery indicators showed 82% charge, temperature normal, current draw within parameters, every diagnostic reading exactly where it should be. The engine stuttered again, then stopped completely. The control panel lit up red. Battery thermal warning, power distribution fault, motor controller disconnect. The lights cascaded across the displays in rapid succession, each one representing another system reporting failure. And my hands were already moving through the diagnostic sequence before my brain caught up to what I was seeing. I killed the main drive. The vibration stopped, but the warning lights stayed bright and urgent against the darkness of the cabin. Come on. My voice sounded thin in the enclosed space. Come on, give me something. The diagnostic screen refreshed. Battery voltage normal. Temperature within parameters. No short circuits detected in the primary distribution system. I pulled up the motor controller logs, scanning through the data for any sign of what had triggered the cascade. Nothing. Every reading showed green except for the one screaming red, and those made no goddamn sense. The thermal warning indicated an overheat condition that the temperature sensors directly contradicted. The power fault suggested a current draw that wasn't appearing in any of the monitoring systems. The motor controller claimed it had disconnected due to phase imbalance, but the 3-phase output looked perfectly synchronized in the logs. I ran the diagnostics again. Same results. Clean power, balanced load, normal temperature, catastrophic failure. Saltwater intrusion. Had to be. Something in the seals had given way, letting the Pacific leak into the motor housing or the controller compartment. The sensors wouldn't catch it immediately. They measured voltage and current and temperature, not the slow creep of conductive seawater bridging contacts that should stay isolated. I pulled up the hull integrity display. All compartments showed normal pressure. No moisture alarms. No indication that anything wet had gotten into anything that should stay dry. But the engine was dead, and something had killed it. My fingers moved through the reset sequence. I'd done this 100 times in training, walked through every failure mode the engineers could imagine. Thermal trip, wait for cooldown, verify temperature, reset the controller, power fault, isolate the affected circuit, verify load, restore power in stages, motor disconnect, check phase balance, verify rotor position, reinitialize the drive system. The controller accepted the reset command. The status display flickered from red to amber to green. I brought the throttle up 5%. The propulsion motor hummed. Smooth and steady, exactly the way it should sound. The vibration was gone. Power draw normal. All phases balanced. I exhaled and realized I'd been holding my breath. The hum changed pitch. Started rough. The vibration came back, harder this time. A grinding shudder that felt wrong in a way I couldn't name but recognized in my gut. The same instinct that made you pull your hand back from machinery that was about to fail. I killed the throttle. The warning lights came back. All of them. Same sequence. Same impossible combination of failures that the diagnostics said couldn't exist. Mechanical fatigue. The system had been running for weeks during my transit to the graveyard, and deep cycle operations put stress on components in ways that didn't always show up in the testing logs. A crack in the motor housing. A failing bearing. Some critical component degraded past the point where it could handle load, breaking down under power and looking normal at rest. I pulled up the maintenance logs, scanning through the service history. The motor had been rebuilt 8 months ago. New bearings, new seals, new rotor assembly. Bench tested to full specifications. The controller was original equipment but had passed every diagnostic during my pre-dive checks. Nothing suggested imminent failure. Nothing explained what I was seeing. I started cycling through the backup systems, looking for alternatives. The submersible had redundant ballast controls. I could surface without propulsion if I had to. Drop the main weights, blow the tanks, let buoyancy carry me up through 3,000 feet of black Pacific water, while I drifted with whatever current wanted to push me around. My hand hovered over the emergency ascent control. The external cameras were still running, their feeds displayed across the lower third of my monitor array. I'd positioned the submersible to keep the German U-boat in frame, the hull number visible through the forward camera while the aft view showed open water and silt. The aft camera caught movement. I stopped breathing. Something rose from the darkness below the graveyard. Pale flesh, the color of scar tissue stretched too thin, luminescent in the way deep-sea creatures sometimes were when their bodies produced their own light. The cameras couldn't capture scale without reference, but I had reference, the wrecks around me, the submarines and destroyers whose dimensions I knew down to the foot. The thing rising toward me was longer than any of them. Its body undulated with terrible grace, moving through the water without apparent effort, without the thrashing struggle of muscles fighting resistance. Smooth, patient, the way something moves when it's lived its entire existence in an environment that would crush anything not perfectly adapted to endure it. I couldn't see all of it. The camera's field of view wasn't wide enough, and the thing kept most of its mass in the darkness below my position. What I could see showed me flesh marked with patterns I couldn't parse, striations or scars or natural coloration that might have meant something to another member of its species, but registered to me only as texture against pale skin. It circled the graveyard. Not hunting, not the rapid strike of a predator that had detected prey. This was methodical, deliberate, the movement of something investigating a signal it had received. The engine, the grinding vibration, the electrical faults cascading through my propulsion system. The thing was drawn to mechanical distress. Understanding crashed over me like a cold wave, and suddenly every impossible detail of the graveyard made perfect sense. The ships hadn't fired on each other. They hadn't maneuvered into attack positions. They'd sat dead in the water. Their engines failed, broadcasting their distress into the deep, while something ancient and patient rose from below to investigate and feed. The sonar logs from the German U-boat had recorded 6-second pulses of noise. The American submarine's final transmission mentioned the engines cutting out. The Japanese destroyer sat intact and undamaged, its hull showing no signs of combat or collision. They'd all gone quiet. All stopped. All died without firing a shot because their weapons didn't matter when the thing that killed them didn't attack from any direction they could defend. It just waited for them to call it up from the abyss. My propulsion system sputtered again without me touching the controls. The vibration shuddered through the hull, and on the monitor, the creature's movement changed. Its circling pattern tightened, spiraling inward toward my position. Toward the source of the mechanical distress signal my failing engine was broadcasting into 3,000 feet of black Pacific water. The pattern snapped into focus. Not gradually, all at once, the way a puzzle image resolves when you finally see what you're looking at instead of just the individual pieces. I thought about mating calls, the way whales sang across entire ocean basins, the way specific frequencies triggered biological imperatives that overrode everything else, or territorial challenges, the way animals responded to threats with violence that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The vibrations had driven it into a killing frenzy. I killed the engine. My hand slammed down on the main power cutoff, not the gradual shutdown procedure they'd drilled into us during certification, but the emergency kill switch that dropped everything at once. The grinding vibration stopped. The control panel went dark except for the battery indicators, still glowing their dim red warning. Not enough. I could still hear the electrical hum of the life support system, feel the faint vibration of the carbon dioxide scrubbers cycling. Every active system was a noise source. Every noise source was a signal propagating through the water. I started shutting down systems one by one. Life support first. I had maybe 6 hours of ambient air in the pressure hull. More if I stayed calm and controlled my breathing. The scrubbers went silent. Then the heating elements. The backup power distribution. The external lights I'd already killed earlier. The internal lights. The communication array went next. Not that it mattered. I was 3,000 feet down and 200 miles from the nearest shipping lane. Nobody was listening. The navigation computer protested with a warning chime before it died. I ignored it. I knew where I was, sinking toward the German U-boat's open hatch. The same hatch I'd illuminated and photographed 4 hours ago when I still thought I was conducting research instead of repeating the exact sequence of events that had killed 70 men. The sonar display faded last, its screen going black just as the spiral pattern reached the center point where my submersible drifted. Then, I was sitting in complete darkness. Not the darkness of a room at night where your eyes adjust and you can make out shapes. Not the darkness of deep water with instruments still glowing. This was absolute. The darkness of being sealed inside a steel sphere 3,000 feet below the surface, with every light source extinguished and no ambient illumination to see by. I felt the descent begin. Without power to the ballast system, I couldn't control my buoyancy. The submersible was slightly negative, designed that way as a safety feature, so if you lost power, you'd sink to the bottom instead of rocketing to the surface and getting crushed by the pressure differential. Real useful safety feature right now. The sinking felt wrong. I was used to controlled descents, the ballast system maintaining steady rates while I monitored depth and adjusted trim. This was just falling. Slow falling through water instead of air, but falling nonetheless. I couldn't see the depth gauge. Couldn't see anything. My hands found the control panel in the darkness, fingers tracing across switches and buttons I'd operated hundreds of times. Muscle memory. The depth gauge should be upper left quadrant, analog backup that didn't need power. I found it by touch and leaned close enough that my nose nearly touched the glass. Nothing. Too dark to read. I settled back in the seat and made myself breathe slowly. 6 hours of air. Maybe more. Enough time for the thing out there to lose interest, to stop circling, to drift away into whatever trench or canyon it called home. Enough time to die of oxygen deprivation instead of whatever had killed the German crew. Real optimistic thinking there. The descent took 12 minutes. I know because I counted seconds in my head. Old habit from free diving in my 20s, before I'd had the sense to realize holding your breath underwater for 3 minutes at a time was a stupid way to prove you weren't afraid of drowning. I got to 720 before I felt the impact. The submersible hit. Hard. Not catastrophic. Not the kind of collision that breaches the pressure hull, but enough to slam me forward against the harness and rattle my teeth. Metal scraped against metal with a shriek that propagated through the hull. Then a grinding vibration as the submersible shifted, tilted, wedged itself into something. I sat frozen, waiting for the sound to fade. It took maybe 10 seconds. The grinding stopped. The vibration settled into stillness, and I was left sitting in absolute darkness with my heart hammering and my breath coming too fast, burning through my limited air supply. Calm down. Breathe slower. Think. I'd landed inside the U-boat. Had to be. The open hatch I'd been sinking toward, the one that had let water flood into the forward torpedo room 70 years ago. My submersible had dropped through it and wedged itself somewhere in the wreckage. My hands found the viewport. I leaned forward, pressing my face against the acrylic, trying to see something. Anything. Darkness. Complete and total. But my mind filled in the details anyway. The skeletal crew I'd photographed earlier still sitting at their stations. Bone and rust and corroded metal. The torpedo racks along the walls. The deck plating buckled from implosion damage. I was sitting among the dead. The submersible had wedged between something. Torpedo racks, maybe, based on the angle. I could feel the tilt, maybe 20 degrees off level. Stuck solid. Even if I restored power to the ballast system, I probably couldn't pull free without maneuvering thrusters, and those would make noise. So I sat there, surrounded by 70 years of corpses in a flooded submarine 3,000 feet below the Pacific surface, waiting in absolute silence. No instruments to check, no lights to see by. Nothing to do but sit in my harness and breathe as slowly as I could manage and listen to my own heartbeat in the darkness. And wonder if the thing outside had heard me land. 3 hours in absolute blackness does something to your sense of time. Stretches it thin and strange until each minute feels like 10, and you lose track of whether you've been sitting there for 20 minutes or 2 days. I sat in my harness, breathed recycled air that tasted flat and chemical. Listened. The creature was searching. I could hear it moving through the graveyard above me, methodical and patient, working some pattern I couldn't predict. Metal groaned somewhere to my north, hull plates flexing under pressure that shouldn't exist at this depth. Then silence. Then the sound again, farther east. My hands stayed locked on my knees. I'd learned that in the first 20 minutes. Any movement, any shift of weight, and the harness creaked. The deck plate settled. Small noises, barely audible inside the hull. But I didn't know what the thing outside could hear. Didn't know what had drawn it to the others. The grinding started again. Low frequency, resonant, vibrating through the water and into my hull and straight into my chest cavity. I felt it in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. Whale song. That's what Freddie Bravo had called it in his log. Sound like whale song, but wrong, sir. Wrong rhythm. Wrong intervals. I heard it clearly now. Not wrong. Just not biological. The pattern was too regular. Too precise. Mechanical grinding translated through water into something that resembled organic sound, the way a synthesizer resembles a violin. Similar frequency range, completely different source. The creature was scraping against the wrecks. I mapped the sound in my head, tracking its movement through the graveyard, north to south along the Japanese destroyer. Pause. East toward the American submarine. The metal-on-metal screech of something massive sliding across corroded hull plating. Freddy had died, listening to this. Sat at his sonar station while this sound grew louder and louder, until it filled his headset. And he knew, must have known, in those final minutes, that whatever was making that noise was coming for them. 80 years ago, he'd written his observations in careful block letters, dated and timed each entry, maintained his professional standards, even as the impossible closed in around him. Now I sat in the darkness 3,000 feet below the surface, reading his mail. My breathing sounded too loud. I tried to slow it, control the rhythm, but my body wanted to pant, wanted to flood my blood with oxygen in preparation for fight or flight. Neither option available at 3,000 feet in a disabled submersible. I breathed through my nose, counted to 4 on the inhale, held it, counted to 4 on the exhale. Meditation technique I'd learned years ago and never thought I'd need. The grinding stopped. Silence pressed against my hull, thick and complete. I couldn't hear my own heartbeat anymore. Couldn't hear anything except the faint electrical hum of the batteries maintaining life support on minimal draw, then displacement. The hull groaned. Not damage, not breach, just pressure differential as something massive moved through the water directly above my position. The submersible rocked slightly, settling deeper into the silt. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The thing was right on top of me, close enough that I could feel it through the hull, the way you can feel someone standing behind you even when you can't see them. Presence. Mass. The water itself pushed down against my shelter, compressed by something that displaced God knew how many cubic meters. My jaw ached. I'd been clenching it without realizing. The displacement moved forward, slowly. The creature was traveling maybe half a knot, drifting more than swimming. My submersible rocked again as the pressure wave passed over the stern. Then it was gone. I waited. Counted to 60. Counted to 60 again. The grinding started up somewhere to the west, fainter now, working its way toward the outer edge of the graveyard. My hands were shaking. I looked down at them in the darkness. Couldn't see them, but I could feel the tremor. Adrenaline crash. I'd been running on pure fight-or-flight chemistry for however long that encounter had lasted, and now my body was paying the bill. I let myself breathe normally. The sound seemed thunderous in the confined space. An hour passed, maybe longer. The grinding continued, sporadic and distant, working some search pattern I couldn't decode. I sat and listened and tried not to think about what would happen if the creature decided to investigate the German wreck more thoroughly. Tried not to imagine that grinding sound growing louder, closer, hull plates peeling back as something vast and hungry reached inside. Freddy would have had these same thoughts, would have sat at his station and listened and known exactly what was coming for him. I wondered if he'd been scared at the end. His logs didn't say. Just recorded observations, technical and precise, right up until the final entry. The passive sonar pinged softly. I'd left it running on minimum power, audio output muted. Just the visual display giving me position data every 30 seconds. The creature was descending. I watched the contact sink on my display, a bright blob of reflected sound dropping away from the graveyard level, down past 3,200 feet, 3,300, still descending, returning to the trench. I waited another hour, sat in the darkness and watched the sonar display and didn't let myself believe I was safe until the contact had been gone for a full 60 minutes without returning. Then I started the engine cold. Risky as hell. Cold starts put stress on components that wanted to warm up gradually, and I didn't know if my earlier emergency shutdown had damaged anything. But a hot start would have meant running diagnostics, warming the fuel cells, bringing systems online in sequence, all of which would have created noise and electrical signatures I couldn't afford. I pressed the ignition. The motor turned over, caught, settled into a low idle that sounded like thunder after 3 hours of silence. Nothing on the sonar, no contacts, no movement from the trench. I engaged the thrusters at 5% power. The submersible lifted from the silt, slow and gentle, debris sliding off the hull with soft scraping sounds that made my teeth hurt. Up. I climbed at 20 feet per minute, the slowest ascent rate I could maintain and still make progress. The wrecks fell away below me. 3 steel coffins full of men who'd encountered something they couldn't explain or escape. Men who'd died confused and terrified, while I sat safe in my bunk, 80 years later, reading their words and thinking I understood. I understood now. 2,500 feet. The pressure eased fractionally. My hull stopped groaning. 2,000 feet. The water was still black, still empty, but the weight of it felt different. Less oppressive, less like being buried. I checked my storage drives. 47 gigabytes of footage, video, sonar logs, spectrographic data, magnetic readings. Everything I'd recorded before the engine failed and the creature came hunting. Evidence. Proof that something lived down there in the trench. Something that had been sinking ships since at least 1943, and probably longer. Something that responded to mechanical distress, drawn to dying engines the way sharks were drawn to struggling prey. Kelly would have questions. The Institute would have questions. The Navy would have questions I probably wasn't cleared to answer. I didn't care. I had the footage, had the data, had 47 gigabytes of proof that would change everything I thought I knew about what lived in the deep. 1,000 feet. The darkness started to thin, black fading to deep blue. 500 feet. I kept climbing, slow and silent, and didn't let myself relax until I broke the surface 6 hours after I descended into the graveyard. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and red, and impossibly bright after so long in the darkness. I sat in my harness and watched the light play across the water and tried to remember how to breathe like a person who wasn't waiting to die. The research vessel Hadley Pioneer sat 300 yards to starboard, white hull bright against the blue water. I could see figures moving on deck. They'd been tracking my ascent. Protocol required constant sonar monitoring during deep operations. And the tender boat was already in the water, heading my way. My hands shook on the controls, adrenaline finally catching up now that the pressure was off, now that I had air above me instead of 3,000 feet of black water. I took a breath. Another. Tried to steady myself. The data recorder sat in its housing beneath the control panel. 16 hours of footage, sonar logs, audio files, temperature readings and depth markers and timestamps for every second I'd spent down there. Everything I'd need to prove what I'd found. 4 wrecks in perfect condition. Radio transmissions describing something in the water. Mechanical distress drawing it close. And that bioluminescence. That impossible organized light moving through the darkness with purpose and intelligence. This would rewrite marine biology. Change everything we thought we knew about deep ocean ecosystems and predator behavior and what could survive at those depths. The Institute would have to mount a full expedition, proper research vessels with multiple submersibles and scientific teams, and all the resources required to study something this significant. The tender boat pulled alongside. I could hear voices calling across the water, see hands reaching for the mooring lines. I was already planning the presentation. Which footage to show first? How to structure the evidence so they'd understand the pattern before they saw what was making it. They got the submersible secured to the crane harness. The winch engaged with a hydraulic whine, and the hull lifted free of the water. I ran through the shutdown sequence, fingers moving across switches and dials I could operate blind. Battery disconnect, pressure equalization, ventilation systems cycling on to replace the stale air with something fresh. The crane swung me over the deck, set me down with a gentle bump that barely registered through the hull. I reached for the hatch release. Dr. Kelly Medina was waiting when I climbed out. That wasn't unusual. The Institute director often met returning expeditions personally when the research objectives were significant. But the two men standing behind her, those were new. They wore dark suits. Neither one had an ID badge visible, and I'd been around enough research vessels to know that everyone wore badges. Coast Guard inspectors, Navy liaisons, even the insurance auditors who showed up once a year to verify our safety protocols. Everyone had credentials displayed. These two didn't. Kelly stepped forward. Her expression was carefully neutral, the same professional mask she wore during budget meetings with skeptical donors. Tom, welcome back. How are you feeling? Tired. I pulled off my glasses, wiped salt spray from the lenses with my shirt. But good. The descent went exactly according to plan. And the site, Dr. Medina, what I found down there, it's unprecedented. I need to get the data downloaded and start processing the footage, but you should know we're looking at something that's going to require immediate follow-up. Multiple submersibles, a full scientific team. Let's get you checked out first. She gestured toward the interior corridor. Medical clearance, debriefing, all the standard protocols. Then we can discuss what you found. The two men hadn't moved, hadn't introduced themselves. Just stood there watching me with expressions that gave away nothing. Something cold settled in my chest. Who are they? Kelly's smile didn't change. Observers. Nothing to concern yourself with. Come on, let's get you inside. I looked at the submersible, at the data recorder housing visible through the open hatch, at 16 hours of evidence that proved something extraordinary lived in the deep Pacific. I'd like to secure the equipment first. Standard procedure. Already handled. One of the men spoke for the first time. Flat voice, no accent I could identify. Our team will manage the data recovery. Your team. I turned back to Kelly. What team? This is Institute equipment. Institute expedition. I'm the principal investigator and protocol has been amended for this operation. The second man moved toward the submersible. Please step away from the vessel, Dr. Robinson. Dr. Robinson. Not Tom. Not even Mr. Robinson. The formal title that created distance and made this official. Kelly touched my elbow. Gentle pressure, guiding me away from the submersible. Tom, please. This will be easier if you cooperate. I pulled my arm free. Easier for who? Kelly, what's happening here? Who are these people? She didn't answer. The two men were already at the submersible, and 3 more had appeared from somewhere. I hadn't seen them on deck when the crane set me down, but they were here now, all wearing the same dark suits and carrying the same unmarked cases. They climbed into the submersible. I started toward them. Kelly stepped in front of me, and her expression had shifted from professional courtesy to something harder. Don't, Tom, I'm serious. Just let them work. Let them work? That's my research. My data. I spent 16 hours in the dark collecting that evidence, and you want me to just stand here while... Yes. No warmth in her voice now. That's exactly what I want you to do. Through the open hatch, I could see them disconnecting the data recorder. Efficient movements, like they'd done this before. One of them had the storage drives out already, sealing them into a case lined with foam padding. The cameras came next. External housings unscrewed with practiced speed. Then the sonar logs, the navigation system, the backup drives I'd installed myself as redundancy. Every piece of equipment that could store data. Every component that had recorded what I'd found 3,000 feet down. They worked in silence. No conversation, no instructions called between them. Just smooth coordination that spoke to training and repetition. It took 47 minutes. I know because I stood there on the deck and watched the entire time. And I kept checking my watch because I needed something concrete to hold on to. Some fact I could verify and trust while everything else dissolved into unreality. 47 minutes to strip the submersible clean. They carried the cases past me. Unmarked black plastic with reinforced corners and combination locks. I counted them. 11 cases total. Every recording I'd made, every data point I'd collected, every piece of evidence that proved what lived in that underwater graveyard. Gone into the hold of a boat I'd never seen before. A gray tender that had pulled alongside while they worked, anonymous and unremarkable. The two men who'd been standing with Kelly followed the cases. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Just climbed into the tender and cast off, and the boat's engine rumbled to life and carried them away across the Pacific swell. Kelly waited until they were 100 yards out before she spoke again. You'll receive your new assignment within the week. Shallow water work, Caribbean coral surveys. The Institute values your expertise in marine ecology, and we're confident you'll make significant contributions to our reef conservation programs. The words came out smooth and rehearsed. She'd practiced this, prepared exactly what to say and how to say it to make the reassignment sound like a lateral move instead of exile. My security clearance. She hesitated. Will be adjusted to match your new responsibilities. Revoked. Adjusted. Don't. My voice came out flat. Don't dress it up. Just tell me straight, they're revoking my clearance, aren't they? Taking my deep water certification, making sure I can't go back down there. Kelly looked at me. The professional mask had cracked enough that I could see something underneath. Not quite sympathy, but acknowledgement at least. Recognition that she was doing something she knew was wrong. Yes, she said. They are. Who's they? Who were those men? What authority do they have to... I don't know. She cut me off. And I don't want to know. They showed me paperwork that was very official and very clear about what would happen if I didn't cooperate. The Institute would lose its federal funding. Our research permits would be revoked. 20 years of work, Tom. Dozens of ongoing studies. Hundreds of jobs. All of it gone if I refused. So you just handed over everything. Didn't even question it. Of course I questioned it. Her voice sharpened. I spent 2 hours on the phone with our lawyers before you surfaced. They advised complete cooperation. Said fighting this would accomplish nothing except destroying the Institute and likely putting me in legal jeopardy I don't even want to contemplate. The tender had disappeared over the horizon. I could still see the wake, white foam dissolving back into blue water. The official report, I said. What's it going to say? Equipment malfunction. Aborted dive at 1,200 feet due to technical issues. Standard safety protocol. Nothing unusual encountered. That's a lie. That's the report. I turned to look at her. Really look at her. at the woman who'd approved my expedition proposal and authorized the funding and told me she believed in pushing the boundaries of deep ocean research. "You know I found something down there. Something significant." Kelly held my gaze. "I know you experienced equipment malfunction at depth and exercised good judgment by aborting the dive. That's what the report says. That's what I know." She left me standing on the deck, walked away without another word, her shoulders straight and her pace measured. The walk of someone who'd made a difficult decision and intended to live with it. The submersible sat in its cradle. Hatch still open. Interior gutted of every component that mattered. I climbed back inside anyway, sat in the pilot seat and looked at the empty housings where the cameras had been mounted, at the blank panel where the data recorder should have been, at the gaps in the instrument array where they'd removed anything capable of storing information. They'd been thorough, professional, known exactly what to take and where to find it. This wasn't improvised, wasn't a panic response to unexpected discovery. They'd been ready for this, waiting for someone to find what I'd found, prepared to disappear the evidence the moment it surfaced. The reassignment papers arrived 6 days later. Shallow water coral surveys in the Caribbean, exactly as Kelly had promised. Beautiful work, really. Important research, studying reef degradation and ecosystem recovery. The kind of assignment most marine biologists would be grateful to receive. I filed the papers in my desk drawer and didn't look at them again. My security clearance was officially revoked on the same day. No explanation provided, just a form letter stating that my authorization for classified research operations had been suspended pending administrative review. A review that would never happen, conducted by administrators who didn't exist, for reasons no one would ever specify. I couldn't go back down, couldn't access the deep ocean submersibles, couldn't even enter the sections of the Institute where the serious equipment was stored. They'd boxed me into shallow water, confined me to depths where sunlight still penetrated and nothing strange or impossible waited in the darkness. No one would hear what I'd found. The data was gone. The footage had disappeared into unmarked cases carried away on an anonymous boat. Even if I tried to tell someone, tried to explain what I'd seen 3,000 feet down, I had nothing to show them. No evidence, no proof. Just a story that sounded increasingly unhinged every time I rehearsed it in my head. No one would see what I'd recorded. The wrecks in perfect condition. The pattern of mechanical distress and organized response. That bioluminescence moving through the water with purpose and intelligence. All of it gone. But I knew. I'd been there. I'd sat in absolute darkness and listened to something vast circle my position. I'd watched that light play across the viewports, blue-green and impossibly bright, beautiful and terrible at the same time. I knew what waited in that graveyard far below, where 4 wrecks sat undamaged in the silt, their crews still at their stations after decades of patience, where something had learned to recognize the sound of metal whales singing their distress, where the keeper remained, eternal and patient, listening for the next vessel to descend into its territory. The Pacific stretched 3,000 feet deep in that location, maybe deeper. The surveys had never mapped it completely. Too remote, too expensive, not strategically significant enough to justify the resources. It was still there, still waiting, still listening for the mechanical songs that meant food had arrived. And I would carry that knowledge alone. Exiled to shallow water, where the light still reached. Stripped of clearance and credibility, and any platform that might let me share what I'd discovered. The truth of what lived in the abyss would stay buried with me, silent and useless, and mine